Marvel Rivals came out yesterday. Marvel Rivals came out a few weeks. Marvel Rivals came out, and so as you guys know, I'm a level design nerd, but I also like to play video games sometimes, particularly hero shooters, and Marvel Rivals is a hero shooter, so I wanted to play it and analyze the maps and make a video about it. So let's get to the level design and see how Marvel Rivals Overwatch. Nailed it. There are a total of 8 maps for 3 different game modes: Domination, Convoy, and Convergence, which I'll refer to using their original names for the rest of the video. 3 pairs of maps share a setting, but have different game modes, and there seems to be no mechanic in place to avoid players playing the same map twice in a row, which is unfortunate because it leads to the map pool feeling a lot smaller than it actually is. There will be play sessions where you'll play 6 to 7 matches on a total of 2 different maps. It can get pretty repetitive looking at the same environment a 4th match in a row, but you know, at least it's good and it's nicely detailed, and sometimes a bit too detailed. In a 6v6 hero shooter game with lots of different abilities, there is bound to be some visual clutter, which is why most hero shooters choose a cartoony, low-detailed art style to combat this problem as much as possible, especially in the field of level art. With this art style, you can create simple environments that allow the player to read your game, but simultaneously look gorgeous and unique. Now, Marvel Rivals has a very similar art style to most successful hero shooters, but some of their levels are still needlessly detailed. Sure, it looks nice, but once there are more than 2 players fighting in this area, it gets incredibly difficult to understand what's going on, especially if you're new to the game. Some maps have too much detailed geometry, highly detailed and animated textures in the middle of arenas, or often just too many flanks and exits to keep track of, which can easily get very overwhelming, but we'll talk about the flanks later. To avoid players getting overwhelmed too frequently, handling visual clutter is very important, and can be pretty tough in Marvel Rivals. Screen space is already a scarce resource in third-person shooters, with a big portion of it constantly reserved for your character. This is especially noticeable when hiding behind and peeking out of cover. Leaving cover to its left or right in a first-person shooter does not really make a difference, because both players will see each other at roughly the same time. The one who holds the angle will always have a slight advantage over the one who peeks it, but how much of an advantage depends on the game and position of the enemy, and the advantage is usually very slim. Here, the person leaving the cover to the right has a significant advantage. They can stay closer to the cover and still see the enemy easily because the cover and their character occupy the same half of the screen, and because of how abilities and attacks are cast in the game. To explain what I mean by that, I need to go on a little tangent. A former Overwatch pro known as Linkser posted a clip on Twitter pointing out why some players may struggle hitting a few different abilities.
Like, look how far to the right I am of this character, okay? Look how far I am aiming. I'm literally aiming like an entire body, and I am perfectly on her. If I'm aiming at the most left side of her, it misses.
This is not an issue unique to Magic, but can be noticed across all heroes. The abilities and hitboxes are fired from the character's weapon. Usually, games will make it look like the shot comes out of a weapon, but instead cast it from the character's eyes so that the shot goes exactly where the crosshair is aiming at. All of this can create situations like these, where I've moved as far out of cover as my enemy has, but they can see my full character model while I can't see a single pixel of them. I now have to move twice as far outside of my cover as my enemy has to, just because I chose to peek on the left side of it, so my enemy has more time to do damage than I do. This is especially problematic on control maps, because the maps are symmetrical, meaning that in a 1v1 scenario, both players can occupy the same position on their side of the map, but one player will have a significant advantage because they spawned on that side of the map. This doesn't necessarily have to be a problem. This could be a very interesting tactical gimmick if the designers design their levels around it. To solve this problem, you can either mirror the maps and flip them on one side, so that occupying the same position leads to the same advantage on both sides, or you need to carefully make sure that every side has similarly strong right-picking positions. Otherwise, one side is automatically favored in what is supposed to be a mirrored game mode. Hybrid and Escort maps also have instances of this happening, but there are a lot fewer moments, and the ones that are there just end up feeling uncomfortable instead of unfair, because these game modes don't have mirrored maps in the first place. So on those maps, it's not really an issue. But these maps are plagued by a different camera perspective related level design issue. That's a mouthful. A third-person game needs more space in a corridor or room than a first-person game, because a player needs to be able to turn around comfortably without the camera creating problems like getting too close to the character and that model filling up the whole screen. If that happens too frequently, be it due to the map geometry or due to character abilities, it's a good indication that there's not enough play space available for all players. This is currently the biggest issue with Marvel Rivals. How this space is missing and what can be done to solve that issue depends on the map, but it generally manifests as one of these three examples. Let's start with the Destructible Environment. The Destructible Environment is a nice addition because it can enable new strategies that are unique to this game. Blow a hole in the wall to bypass a tight choke. Deny enemy high ground by destroying the access path. Or just confirm a kill on an enemy that felt too safe in their position. All of this is possible thanks to Destructible Environment.
Thanks, Destructible Environment! Thank you!
Not all environment is destructible, which is good. You need some solid high grounds and covers in this type of game. But the destructible environment is visually indistinguishable from the solid geometry, which makes it a bit tricky to differentiate in the heat of battle. Therefore, the developers added a destruction vision, which will show you which bits are destructible while holding the destruction vision key. And although this is a solution that works, I still would have wished for the destructible environment to be visually distinct. Maybe it's exclusively made of materials that are weaker than stone, like glass or wood, but just something that immediately tells me this can be destroyed without the need for a destruction vision button. Additionally, every map setting has a unique gimmick related to the destructible environment. The Wakanda maps will activate different map effects, like fog or a baby meteor shower, if enough of the environment was destroyed. The Tokyo maps have spiders holding up the roofs of the destroyed buildings. I think that's the gimmick because I haven't encountered any other special events on those maps. On Clintar, you can activate temporary walls and bridges by damaging them, and on the Asgard maps, the geometry will regenerate after a few seconds. These gimmicks can be very irritating at first, but then you get used to them and they can either be annoying or, well, surprising. But I never found myself, or any other team that I played against, playing around these mechanics. Except for the Clintar gimmick, that one can be pretty neat. Sometimes the destructible environment works well, when you can use it to outplay the enemy team, but you will just as often find some uncomfortable or even pointless constructions like really tight corridors or empty rooms that seem to exist for the sole purpose of showing off this mechanic. The player shouldn't be forced to destroy specific walls that are indistinguishable from all the other walls just to feel comfortable moving around in this space. 12 players fighting around an objective as big as the payload requires a lot of map space, and with it already being very limited on most maps, taking some of it away just to get players to interact with your unique mechanic is going to lead to more visual clutter and to more uncomfortable fights. The second example which makes this missing space noticeable are the flanks. Flanks are often too narrow, which makes players feel uncomfortable or worse, confuses them. Far too often do I walk through a corridor and have difficulties finding out what awaits me in the next room because the camera is forced to be dead straight behind the character, otherwise your entire screen fills with your hero's backside. To avoid confusion, it's important that players never lose track of where they are in relation to the objective. That's why most games go for a main lane plus 2 to 3 flanks map design. The main lane will always be the most direct and obvious path to the objective with the most action. So the trick is to make it clear to players which lane is the main lane and then have the flanks wind along that main lane, frequently connecting the two so players always know where they are in relation to the main lane and by proxy where they are in relation to the action. Got it? In Marvel Rivals, flanking players can be completely shut off from the main path for a while, getting confused and lost due to the missing connections. It's especially noticeable on the Hydra map because that one is set inside a gigantic complex. In Overwatch, you can also find yourself shut off on flanks, but players never feel lost because the maps where this happens take place in virtual fresh air, which means you can see what building you enter and where it is in relation to the main lane before you enter it. Alternatively, they add a glass window so you can still make the visual connection without having a real connection. In Rivals, they try to make up for that by adding sort of landmarks to the flanks to make them more memorable. But those take away even more of the already limited play space, so it just makes the flanks feel even more claustrophobic. Additionally, the insufficient play space on the main lane can lead to players being confused about where it is, even if there are enough connections, because it's not obvious enough if this is a connection to a different flank or the main lane, given the objective or action is not right in front of them. This makes it harder for players to create a mind map of this level, which is extremely important because it helps them feel comfortable moving around and allows them to outthink their enemies. I made a whole video on the topic of designing great cognitive maps, so if that interests you, you know where to find it. While flanking, you'll frequently encounter some needlessly unintuitive connections to other flanks. You'll end up in situations like these, where the game presents multiple identical doors to you, and now it's on you to decide which path excites you more. All of this makes the flanks very irritating and uncomfortable to use, so players usually just stay on the main lane, which creates even more traffic there, once again amplifying the lack of space. So what's your solution, I hear you asking? Well, with a wider corridor, I'd feel more comfortable moving around here and committing to this flank because I'd be able to see what's coming up ahead. This would also lessen the probability of players getting lost on flanks and would even enable combat in these long corridors without constantly getting in your own way and losing track of your opponent. Besides this, you'd want to simplify the flank geometry but avoid making them boring. So basically, remove the unnecessary walls that create the need for unnecessary doorways. Like this, they're easier to overlook for those who can be flanked, and they're easier to navigate for those who flank. So generally, giving players more room on flanks, like here, leads to less confusion and less traffic on the main lane. The final example of missing space are some of the poorly designed payload checkpoints. If you've seen my How to Escort video, you know how important it is to clearly communicate important information through your geometry, and that the less you have to rely on information from UI elements, the better the gameplay experience for the player will be, especially in stressful situations. Players have to make split-second decisions to know where to set up, when to engage, whether they have to use their ultimate, etc. And the more information they have to read from the UI, instead of intuitively gathering it from the battlefield, the harder it is to make that decision. And a decision that turns out wrong only feels fair if the game presents all the needed information in an easily digestible way. So players need to understand during their first time playing on a map what and where their objectives are and where they can set up to defend them. And the easiest way to communicate that is by creating a big open space surrounded by simple but clearly defined vantage points like high ground. Now this problem isn't nearly as common as it was in Shatterline, but it's arguably worse in the places where it does happen. The best, or rather worst example of this is the final point on Clintar. Wait, it's there? It's not even where the path ends, it's over there. That's ridiculous. That's right, Crab. No big final point that the entire map has been building up to narratively. Barely any geometry here indicates that there is a final point around here somewhere. Equally absent is the geometry enabling defenders to have their final stand against the attackers. No level art or geometry indicating where the exact checkpoint trigger is. And if that wasn't enough to make this the worst checkpoint in the history of Escort maps, the checkpoint itself isn't even under the arch where the path ends, no, because that would salvage this mess at least a little bit. It's on a random spot in the corner leading up to it. The reason this upsets me so much is because we have proof that they can do it, like here and here. So how does such a monumental fuck up make it into the final build of the game? I don't get it. Anyway, with your non-final checkpoints, you can always be a little more reserved, even though I feel like this is a little too reserved. No need to go all out, just a clear message that this is a checkpoint, like a platform on the floor or a closed door, bars. But a final checkpoint should be a grandiose finale, the point that the entire map has been building towards, narratively and also in terms of tension for the players. It's a final standoff where the defenders desperately want to keep their hopes alive of winning this game, so it's important to support that feeling and let everybody know where this final fight takes place. And no, putting a UI marker there does not solve the problem. You want to show with your map geometry and level art that this is where the payload path ends and where everyone will engage one last time in an all-out brawl for the win of this map. During the making of this video, Season 1 started, and with it came a new map, so I briefly want to talk about Midtown. It's not a very pretty map, mostly just grey tall buildings, and I was surprised to see that it features a lot less destructible geometry than the other maps. But still, a lot of the same issues from the other maps persist, even if they're a bit less common now. The main lane is still not always recognizable due to missing play space, and that missing play space still leads to a lot of uncomfortable fights with tons of visual clutter. Lots of high grounds on this map are still way too small for a third-person game, leading to more uncomfortable fights if you're not playing on the main lane. The thing that does seem to have improved with this map though, is that flanks connect to the main lane more frequently, so even if it's sometimes tough to recognize where the main lane is, you can track it and integrate it into your mind map a lot easier. And the checkpoints are more recognizable. Oh no, not again. I mean, this is still not amazing, but I'm not gonna pretend that this is even remotely as bad as on Clintar. Players can still deduce from the surrounding geometry that this is the final stretch, and even if they don't know exactly where the payload stops, they will still give it their all once it's on this final stretch. But still, you could do a lot better. I've struggled a lot with the thought of making this video, because I wanted to be careful to not just make another hit piece to fuel the ongoing Marvel Overwatch culture war. I've tried keeping the comparisons to a minimum, so that it wouldn't just be a video pointing out all the failures of the game and comparing it to Overwatch to prove with facts and science once and for all that Marvel Rivals is an objectively worse game. No. I focused on what went wrong, because that's the most interesting and the most important part for a level designer. You need to find out what's wrong in order to make good levels. Next to that, I believe it's also important to not just point out things that are wrong, but also display and point to potential solutions for these problems. And I think, at least in terms of level design, or more specifically flank and checkpoint design, Overwatch has the solutions that Marvel Rivals should be looking for. So to recap, what needs to be done for these maps to be great? Simplify the level art where it's a problem. Be mindful of the problems and constraints that your choice of camera perspective brings with it, and design around them. So give players more space on flanks, and make sure that your symmetrical maps are not decided by who spawns on what side. Implement the destructible environment in a way that feels natural, so in a way that it enhances or counters the strategic movement of players around the map, and doesn't needlessly block valuable play space. Simplify the flank designs by giving players more space to fight and also just breathe. And for the love of God, please make every checkpoint recognizable through geometry like this, please, please. It's a lot of work, and I hope they can pull it off. Speaking of hero shooter level design, if you remember my very first big project on this channel, my self-made Overwatch map, I updated that and put it on my itch.io. So if you're interested in that map, then click the first link in the description. You'll find all of my other projects on there as well. Now pay close attention, because I'm announcing that my next video will have a big announcement, and I know you'll like it, but I don't know yet when it's coming out, so I guess you'll just have to subscribe. Alright everyone, I haven't brushed my teeth in a year. Wait, no, that doesn't really work in a video. Just take care.